Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions. I am Debra Maldonado.
I'm Dr. Rob.
And we're with CreativeMind, bringing you Jungian coaching, the original Jungian coaching from
That's right.
Over a decade ago. We've been teaching this philosophy. And today we're going to shift gears. And for the next few episodes, we're going to do a series on the concept of consciousness. So before we begin, though, I do want to remind you, if you are not subscribing to our podcast, please do. That helps us reach more people. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you click the button in the corner and make sure you get every notification for new episodes when they arrive.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. That's my little. So let's talk about consciousness, because a lot of people confuse what consciousness is. Like it's a term that's used in different disciplines like science, and then in psychology and spirituality.
Yeah, so the way we want to define it in our series is that it is the pure awareness at the core of our being. So this definition comes from the philosophy that's called non-duality. And non-duality is really a worldwide phenomenon. You'll see it in many, many cultures. The only thing is that in the Upanishads, it explains it very clearly. And the Upanishads are really part of humanity. They're some of the oldest scriptures in the world. And so we base our work on the Upanishads. They're very instructional, very clear on what the nature of consciousness is. It's not what we call in the West cognition.
Like I'm coming to consciousness, or it's my consciousness, self-consciousness, those type of descriptors.
And often, in the West, we think of consciousness as being aware of something in particular, like or thinking something or being aware of something. We think that's consciousness. So we'll get into kind of what the distinction is on that. And
so Advaita, Vedanta means not two, which is that non-dual. And when we think of non-dual, it means that there is no separation between what we see in the world, everything we're aware of, and ourselves. So there's a world of objects, but we are connected to all of them.
Absolutely. So the first truth that we can state is that pure consciousness is not an object. It is the subject. So here we're talking about everyone's favorite subject, yourself.
But not your personality.
Not your personality, but who is the one observing the screen and hearing this lecture or this podcast. That you is that pure consciousness. That's what we're talking about. That core of who you feel you are, what allows you to perceive, to think, to experience. That is the subject. In other words, you're the subject that observes the objects of the world.
And with this idea of, I hear a lot of people counter this idea that you create your life, and they're like, did I create these bad things? And, this is all a reflection of your mind. And they take it from a very personal place where their persona, and Jungian psychology, that conscious personality, they think that's what we're talking about, or what the sages are talking about. But we're talking about the deeper self, that there's a deeper self within us.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the misunderstanding arises because people read the non-dual literature from the perspective of dualism, from the idea that we're all separate and that we're existing in a material universe. And if you read it from that perspective, you're misunderstanding the whole point of the literature of the Upanishads. They're speaking and were written from the perspective of non-dualism, which is this understanding that everything is consciousness.
So this pure consciousness is the ground of everything.
Yes.
And we are that consciousness. So how do we access it? It's right here all the time. It's hiding in plain sight as the witness.
It hides within plain sight because it appears as two. It appears as the subject, you, the observer, and then the objects that you're observing or the experiences that you're having. So it appears that there's two things. There's you, the observer, and the world out there or the experiences that you're having as objects or as events, as experiences. That is an illusion, and we'll talk about that later. The illusion that the mind creates in creating this separation. In actuality, the ground of being is both. It's both the objects that you're perceiving as well as you, the observer.
That's like a hard thing too. And if you don't get it immediately, you're totally normal, because it's really hard, because we've been brought up to believe that we're in this body, and then there's a world that's separate from us. And we have to like move our physical body in the world to achieve things, to do things, to interact with other people. And there's another person that has nothing to do with us that can randomly come into our life and break our heart or hurt us in some way, or even lift us up in some way. But we're in this consciousness studies, we're really seeing that they're reflecting us. They're reflecting a part of us. Not always a direct reflection, but there's something there that we're contributing to it. I always say we fit together like puzzle pieces. We're always, like we're seeing a part of ourselves in everything out there.
Yes, that's a good point. I was thinking of something as you were saying that, but it'll come to me. But this idea of separateness is kind of what we work with in the West, right? In the materialistic philosophy of the Western science, for example, we're thinking, no, matter is the absolute reality. And if we can figure out matter, meaning the objects, we can figure out what they're made of and how they work, we'll figure out what the universe is made out of, how it works. That's the approach in the West. It's completely the opposite of non-dualism, because non-dualism says, no, understanding the observer, the witness of that material universe will give you the right answer. In other words, you will understand what the universe is by understanding the observer.
So you're not your thoughts. You're not the events in your life. You are the observer. So we tend to define ourselves by what we achieve, what we don't achieve, what people think about us. I mean, that's the ego. Separates everything. And so if we define ourselves by external, it's a very powerless place to be, because we're waiting for permission to be or express something. We're waiting for some external luck to come in to endow us with riches or love. And we're feeling that separation. And that's why there's so much anxiety and people are unhappy with their life because they feel powerless. And what I love what you always teach, and you didn't bring this up, but I want to bring this up, is that in the West, they believe that consciousness arises from the brain. That's the Western perspective, is that if you just change your brain and then all these thoughts and this world comes through the brain, it's actually consciousness is, the brain is inside consciousness. And the brain arises from consciousness, not the consciousness arises from the brain.
Yes, it's a very different perspective. So we can say that consciousness, that pure consciousness, the pure awareness, illuminates the brain as well as the mind. Now, this is verifiable. This is not abstract thinking or purely abstract. If you can observe your thoughts, this means that there's an observer and the thoughts themselves, right? That the thoughts are appearing to the observer, to the witness.
So there's like a self-reflective quality we have, that there's a witness, the thoughts, and then that witness is reflecting on the thoughts and reflecting on your life. I mean, that's what makes us, beautifully advanced creatures in the world. We can examine our life.
Yeah. So, for example, I use this simple example. if you think of a giraffe, like go ahead and think of a giraffe right now. Visualize it in your head, right, in your mind. Visualize a giraffe, how its weird form, right? Its long neck and its little horns and all that stuff. Its colors, the way it moves. You can see it, right? You can observe it in your head. Now, if I ask you, do you see it in your mind right now? The witness then looks inside your mind and can say yes or no. Am I seeing the giraffe? Now that means the witness is separate from the thought of the giraffe. It's not identical. It's not caught up in the experience of seeing the giraffe.
So is it kind of like if the tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound?
Kind of.
There's no one to witness it, except there's, creatures and consciousness and all that. But,
well, that has to do with the senses, right? So how does our brain then kind of perceive the world, the world of objects, through our senses? Like if we did not have senses, our brain essentially would be blind. It wouldn't see, experience, it wouldn't hear anything. The senses feed it information to this apparent experience of the world outside of the skull.
So if the senses were shut out, like if you were in a coma laying next to that tree, you wouldn't have senses. Your senses would be shut down or closed in to not be aware of that.
That's right. And so if you're not aware of something, right, or through the senses, it doesn't register as an experience. It's a little bit different, but it gets to this idea of what is the brain, how does the brain work? Now, keep in mind, the brain is different than consciousness. But it sounds contradictory because aren't we saying that all is one? Like everything is one, non-duality. Therefore, why are we talking about the witness and the object, or the subject and the object? Well, it's like this, that if we think of a dream, for example, last night most of us had or remember a dream, perhaps. In the dream, let's say you dreamt that you were driving a car. So the driver of the car is the subject, right? And the car is the object. So the subject is driving the object. The you in the dream are driving your car or a car.
But there's also an awareness that you remember that you are witnessing yourself driving the car as well.
Well, we'll get to that. But just that those two elements, right? You are driving a car in the dream. If we ask, what was the car made out of, and what was the you that you experienced in the dream made out of? They were both made out of mind stuff, dream stuff. They arose and were illuminated by the light of your mind, your mind, right? Your imagination or your dream imagination created those things. Both it created you and the car. The same principle is applicable in our everyday human experience. The objects that we see in the world, the trees, the buildings, the other people, the rooms, the computers, everything, as well as your mind body, your individual mind body that you're seeing or that you believe you are in your personal experience, both are arising or are kind of, you're experiencing those things in pure consciousness, in pure awareness. All the elements. Therefore, that's the non-dual aspect of this, that both the subject and the object are within consciousness.
Well, you know what helped me understand it a little more? I always like metaphors because it's so much easier to grasp. This idea of the clay in the pot. Is like that you have a piece of clay and think of the clay as pure consciousness. Well, there's a pot in that clay. It just hasn't been shaped yet. And so when you reshape the clay, it becomes a pot. but it's not a pot until it needs the clay. The pot needs the clay to become a pot. It can't be a pot independently. And so they're intricate, they're like tied because they can't exist without each other. So if you think of consciousness, and then it gets shaped in different forms, like it gets shaped in a house, and it gets shaped in a person, and it gets shaped in a computer, and it gets shaped in your cell phone right now. And all those things are aspects of consciousness, but the underlying substance is pure consciousness. And so and it's one. So we're all connected, having a different aspects of it. Just like in a dream, all those objects in the dream are part of your consciousness, that individual consciousness that you have, that's part of the larger consciousness. And you're experiencing these worlds. And how are they made? They're made from that same substance. So it's sort of like the world you live in is like a dream. Like we're experiencing a waking dream in the world, and everything is made of that consciousness. So from a practical standpoint, what is really important about knowing this? How is this going to help someone, especially as a coach? How does this non-dual consciousness and understanding that pure consciousness is who we are affect coaching?
Yeah. One of the first truths that really starts to set us free as we use non-duality as a foundational philosophy is the fact that it shows us very clearly that we're not the role that we're playing in society. Mm-hmm. In other words, the role that this mind body, as Dr. Rob or Debra, that we're playing in our society. And we're doing it well, trying to do our best, right? We're playing the role as best we can. It doesn't mean we give up or run away from it. We accept the responsibility of these roles, but that these roles do not define us, that we are something else behind that. There's a deeper reality that supports it. That's why we call it the ground of being, because it is the foundational reality that we're talking about, that then we can understand the roles that we're playing in society from the right perspective.
Now, when you talk about roles, it makes me think of shadow work. And so many people, go through our program. And I always remind our coaches that shadow work isn't about healing the past or healing yourself or fixing trauma or anything like that. Shadow is really our acknowledgement that we're seeing ourselves as a reflection in others. It's understanding reclaiming those projections that we have out into the world. And then again, being able to disidentify with the roles that we think we need to play in order to survive. And then we really have a choice. So if we're pure consciousness and everything's one, and we get to choose who we want to be, and whatever we see in the world is only a reflection of our minds, then what freedom can that be? I remember when I first met you, and I went to a book convention, because I was author convention, because I was trying to get my first book published. And I called you on the phone, and Rob was home, and I said, Rob, I'm really nervous. I'm going to meet all these editors and publishers, and I'm just kind of nervous going down to this cocktail hour by myself. And he said, don't be nervous. They're just a bunch of yous down there. I was like, oh, yeah. So it's like you're meeting yourself everywhere. And so it's a really, really hard concept to grasp. And I can understand if you're listening to this and there's pushback. But once you do the shadow work in a deep, meaningful way, from a non-dual perspective, not from affixing your personality, but from really seeing who you are, everything starts to change in your life, and life becomes freer. You feel less anxiety, you feel less stress, you feel less pressure to live up to other people's expectations. And you start to define what your expectations for yourself are in your own life and for your own self.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the shadow, because this is important in our work. We always emphasize that you cannot get to really get to experience the non-duality nature of life and reality if you do not do shadow work, because you're still identifying as a persona before you do shadow work. You're still believing that you are this role that you're playing in life as the individual.
And even like any kind of spiritual work, if you approach it from an ego perspective, there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. There's this propping up this spiritual identity. I'm going to wear the spiritual clothes and the necklaces and be all sweet and nice. And then we're suppressing all the things that are not spiritual or not acceptable in that those communities. And then we're still kind of trapped, even though it feels good and light and everyone's loving, but we're not really being authentic. We're still playing a role. And we have to acknowledge that when we're coming from ego. And not all spiritual disciplines are like this, but we see that a lot of people do a lot of spiritual work, but then they haven't really disidentified with the ego. And they're still kind of dragging it along with them.
Yes.
And then the mental clarity is another thing. When we're looking at the witness mind, and just from a coaching perspective, you're not identifying with the thoughts. You're seeing the thoughts there, and you're becoming the witness versus being a part of the thinking and thinking those are me, those thoughts are me, and identifying with the thoughts. Now, I know that sounds counter to what we were saying, and everything's one, but the thing is the thoughts aren't real. And the only thing that's real is consciousness.
Yeah, that's it. There's a beautiful story in the Upanishads of a king who dreams that his kingdom is overrun by a foreign army, and he's taken captive and is starving, essentially thrown in prison, and the last morsel of food is left, and he says, okay, just give me whatever is left, because he's standing in line and he's the last one. And then he's about to eat the last morsel of food, and a hawk comes and snatches it from his hand, so that he's completely depressed and anxious and feels hopeless. And he wakes up and realizes, oh, I was dreaming. But he's very moved by that dream because it was very real to him and really showed him kind of what the loss of all his wealth and pleasure in life would mean to him. He would feel completely abandoned. And so he calls upon the wise men of the kingdom to tell him, was that dream real, or is this the reality of my life, the kingdom, the waking life of his kingdom? And nobody can answer that question until the final wise man comes and says, okay, so who experienced that dream? And he says, well, I did. Janaka, King Janaka experienced that dream. And who is experiencing this waking life of being a king? Myself, Janaka, as well. So he says, both that dream and this reality that you're living as a king are unreal. The only reality is the witness, you. You are the reality, because in the dream, everything is always continuously changing until it ends, right? It just disappears. He says, in this reality, it will be the same thing. Everything continues to change and morph, and you get old, and then it vanishes and disappears. Therefore, it cannot be an absolute reality.
So everything that's changing is unreal, and the unchanging is real, and the unchanging is pure consciousness.
Pure consciousness is unchanged and unmoved and untainted by the experiences of either a dream or a waking experience.
And so the implications of that for our life, you know, how many people do personal development and they talk about their life experiences and trauma and things that happened to them, or, you know, setbacks, or even like tragedies that have happened. People die, or some people get sick, or we see that, like, not to disconnect from it where we're disassociated, but seeing it as not as real as it is, and that there's an everlasting, constant presence within us that can never die, that can never get hurt. And that is where we can rest in. And I remember some of my toughest times in life, I would like imagine falling back into this light of nothingness, like my personality and my body and everything would just like be in the world. And there was this other part of me. And I'm like, there's nowhere to fall, because the consciousness is going to catch us. And for me, people argue, kind of fight that we're not. This is not me, and that's not me, and that person isn't me. But when we really see that it's just like a dream, and we start to see the presence within us, is that kind of constant presence is always there, then it gives us a sense of peace and relief and calm. And that's why meditation is really great, because you get in to turn inward, turn your senses off from the external world, and you're going inward and you're being with that witness. You're spending time with your own divine nature. And it's such a beautiful thing. So we have so much more to cover on this topic of consciousness. We're going to talk about projection next week, and how that works with consciousness, and how we can reclaim our projections to connect again to the witness. And but I just want to end with that beautiful story, because that was really, really perfect for us to remember the truth of who we are. And I invite you all to don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. If you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, all those great podcast services, hit subscribe so you can get the rest of the series. It's going to be incredible. And also, if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to click the subscribe button and the notification. So when we release a new episode, you have a notification and can watch the show. So,
all right. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. Have a great week. Bye-bye.